The answering machine beeped 3 times that day. 3 messages, 3 chances. Mark Lanegan sat in his dirty bathrobe, listening to Kurt Cobain's voice getting more desperate with each call. He never picked up, and 30 years later, he's still living with what happened next. April 5, 1994, Seattle, Washington. Mark Lanegan was lying around his apartment in dirty boxers and a stained bathrobe. A Stranglers record was playing. The TV was on, muted. He had cash. He had drugs. He had everything he needed to get through another day of not thinking about anything important. Then the phone rang. He looked at it, didn't move. The answering machine clicked on. Kurt Cobain's voice filled the room. Intense whisper. Mark didn't pick up. He just sat there, listening, watching Kurt's voice turn into silence, watching the machine reset. An hour later, the phone rang again. Kurt's voice, again. Mark still didn't move. Dark. And then, a few hours later, it happened a 3rd time. 3 calls, 3 messages, 3 chances to answer the phone and talk to his friend. Mark Lanegan never picked up once. I fucking sat there and listened to him speak into my answering machine 3 times that day. Mark would confess 26 years later in his memoir. Any advice for young people who want to play music and avoid these trappings? Clearly, I'm not the guy to give advice. That should be pretty obvious. But to understand why Mark didn't answer that phone and why he's carried the weight of that decision for 3 decades, you need to go back to the beginning, to 1989, to a library in Ellensburg, Washington, to the moment when Mark Lanegan first saw Kurt Cobain and thought he was witnessing something touched by greatness. But here's where the real story begins. It was supposed to be about bass players. Mark Lanegan's band, Screaming Trees, had just lost their bassist Van Connor. Mark was on the hunt for a replacement. His friend and housemate Dylan Carlson told him about a band playing at the Ellensburg Public Library, a weird venue for a rock show, but this was the late 80s Pacific Northwest. Everything was weird. "Come check out this band," Dylan said. "They've got this bass player, you'll see." Mark went. He walked into that library expecting to scout a musician. What he found was Kurt Cobain. As they took the stage, I was immediately struck by the bass player. Mark would later write in his memoir, a 6'7" tall giant with a fierce intensity, obvious before even playing a note. He looked pissed off, and I was instantly drawn to him. That giant was Chris Novoselic. Mark's plan was simple: steal him away from this unknown band and make him Screaming Trees' new bassist. Mysterious, but then Kurt started singing, and everything changed. The show ended prematurely, a scheduling error with the library, but Mark didn't care about the bass player anymore. He was transfixed by the small blonde guy with the voice. After the show, Mark approached Kurt to congratulate him. Kurt's response shocked him. "I love Screaming Trees," Kurt said, his eyes lighting up. "We should collaborate on something." They exchanged phone numbers right there. Mark walked back to his apartment with what he described as an electricity in my step and a newfound buoyancy of spirit. "I couldn't shake the notion that I had just experienced something touched by greatness," Mark wrote. The phone rang a few days later. But it wasn't the call Mark expected. It was Chris Novoselic. He was calling to ask if Mark wanted to join Nirvana. Wait, what? Chris explained that he and Kurt were having differences. Maybe it would be better if Mark came in and helped them sort things out. Maybe even join the band permanently. Mark could have said yes. Imagine that alternate timeline. Mark Lanegan as a member of Nirvana, the biggest band in the world. Instead, Mark gave Chris advice that would change music history. "Stay with Kurt," Mark told him. "You guys are onto something. Don't break that up." Dramatic. Mark never mentioned that call to Kurt. It was easy for them to become friends after that. Just a couple of long phone calls talking about girls, music, life. They connected immediately. "I loved Kurt, and I envied him," Mark later admitted, "because Nirvana were fully developed from the first moment I heard them. Great songs, great singer, great look, everything." Kurt felt the same way about Mark. According to Dave Grohl, Kurt looked up to Lanegan. That respect was mutual and deep, and it led to one of the most beautiful collaborations that almost was. After Nirvana wrapped their 1989 Bleach tour, Kurt started spending days at a time at Mark's place in Olympia, Washington. They'd sit around listening to old blues records, particularly Lead Belly, the American folk and blues musician who died in 1949, but whose raw, emotional music spoke to both of them. He was someone that Kurt and I both enjoyed listening to, and we'd listen together, Mark recalled. One afternoon, while a Lead Belly record spun on the turntable, one of them said, "We should do a record of this stuff." The other responded, "We should do a record of all Lead Belly covers." They were excited. They started planning it immediately. Original songs, too. A full collaboration. They'd call it The Jury, or maybe Lithium, which was Kurt's preference. They scheduled a session at Reciprocal Recording with producer Jack Endino. Chris Novoselic would play bass. Mark Pickerel from Screaming Trees would be on drums. It was happening. Intense. But when they showed up to the studio, everything had changed. "Well, we tried writing some songs," Kurt told Jack Endino, "but we didn't record them and we forgot them all. So we're going to do some Lead Belly songs instead." The original song collaborations were abandoned. Just like that. Instead, they recorded a handful of Lead Belly covers, including Where Did You Sleep Last Night, a haunting folk song about betrayal, murder, and cold nights in the pines. Mark sang lead. Kurt played guitar and sang backing vocals. Despite being the least musically proficient member of Screaming Trees, Mark wrote, "It had become obvious to me early on that I had to be the default leader of the band, simply due to force of personality. I was used to directing Screaming Trees recording sessions." Emotional. But with Kurt, Mark couldn't do it. "I couldn't bear to do that in this situation," Mark confessed. "I was too awed by Kurt's genius." Think about that. Mark Lanegan, one of the greatest vocalists in rock history, was intimidated by Kurt Cobain's talent. The session produced 4 songs. Where Did You Sleep Last Night ended up on Mark's solo album The Winding Sheet in 1990. Kurt's guitar work is unmistakable, his backing vocals haunt the track. But the full collaboration, the album they dreamed about, never happened. Dark Whisper. Maybe it was never supposed to. Years later, on November 18, 1993, Kurt would perform Where Did You Sleep Last Night at Nirvana's MTV Unplugged session. It would become one of the most powerful, devastating performances in rock history. Kurt's voice cracking with emotion, his eyes wide and haunted in those final notes. Dave Grohl later explained why Kurt chose that song. Kurt looked up to Lanegan. "The Winding Sheet was a huge influence on our Unplugged thing. It was a tribute, a thank you, a nod to the friendship that had shaped both of them." Shocking, but by then, the friendship was already fracturing. Sometime in the early 90s, things changed. Kurt got famous. Massively, globally, suffocatingly famous. Mark was still grinding it out with Screaming Trees. They had respect, they had influence, but they didn't have Nirvana's success. And Kurt married Courtney Love. That's when things got complicated. Mark and Courtney had a difficult relationship. There was drama, always drama. Fights, chaos, emotional whiplash. "I had become conditioned to avoid both of them at the same time," Mark admitted. "There was always drama involved at that point, and I didn't want to get involved." So Mark started pulling away. Not from Kurt exactly, but from the situation, from the circus that Kurt's life had become. Phone calls became less frequent. Hangouts were rare. By 1994, Kurt was spiraling. Everyone could see it. The heroin use, the depression, the suicide attempt in Rome in March, the intervention, the rehab. And on April 1, 1994, Kurt escaped from Exodus Recovery Center in Marina del Rey, California. He jumped over a 6-foot brick wall and disappeared. Urgent, nobody knew where he went. Private investigators were hired. Friends were looking. Dylan Carlson, Mark's roommate and Kurt's close friend, was frantically searching. But Kurt had vanished. And on April 5th, somewhere in Seattle, Kurt Cobain picked up the phone and called Mark Lanegan. The phone rang. Mark looked at it from his spot on the couch. He was high. He had money. He had his drugs. He didn't want to deal with anything complicated. The answering machine clicked on. Kurt's voice. Mark listened. He heard Kurt asking to come over, asking to hang out, asking to listen to some records. Simple requests, normal friend stuff. Intense whisper, but Mark didn't pick up. I blew off Kurt, Mark would later confess, because A, I had quite a bit of cash at the moment and plenty of dope, so the thought of possibly running out to score for him was a drag, and B, I assumed Courtney would be there. Mark didn't want to be the middleman, didn't want to be dragged into their drama, didn't want to play what he called the pawn in a fucked-up chess game that particular day, so he let it go to voicemail. An hour later, the phone rang again. Kurt's voice. Again. Still asking. Still hoping. Mark didn't pick up. Despite the gnawing feeling that I was the world's shittiest friend, Mark wrote, I never picked up. Dark. And then, a few hours later, it happened a third time. 3 calls. 3 messages. 3 chances. Mark just lay there in his dirty boxers and stained robe listening to a Strangler's record, staring at the silent TV screen. I was oblivious, he wrote, to the gathering storm headed in my direction. A day passed. Then 2. Mark's roommate Dylan Carlson was getting worried. Kurt wasn't answering his phone. Nobody knew where he was. Kurt hadn't called me, Mark told Rolling Stone in May 1994, just weeks after Kurt's death. He hadn't called some other people. He hadn't called his family. He hadn't called anybody. But that wasn't entirely true. Kurt had called Mark 3 times. Mark just hadn't answered. By April 7, Dylan was in full panic mode. He convinced Mark to help search for Kurt. They enlisted Tom Grant, a private investigator Courtney had hired. The 3 of them drove around Seattle, checking every dealer they could think of, every spot Kurt might be. Urgent whisper. Then they went to Kurt's house. The big house near Lake Washington, the place Kurt shared with Courtney and their daughter Frances Bean. They walked in, called Kurt's name, room to room. Nothing. They checked the bedrooms, the living room, the basement, the kitchen. But they didn't check the greenhouse above the garage, the little workshop where Kurt sometimes went to be alone. Every last dealer we could think of, Mark later remembered. And then Kurt's house, calling his name from room to room. They left, assuming Kurt wasn't there. But he was. He had been there the whole time, in that greenhouse, behind barricaded French doors. 2 days later, on April 8, an electrician arrived to install a security system. He found Kurt's body. According to the medical examiner, Kurt had been dead for approximately 2.5 days, which meant he died on April 5th. The same day he called Mark 3 times. When Mark heard the news, something inside him shattered. I had a feeling that something real bad had happened, he told Rolling Stone that May. But to the reporter, he lied. He said Kurt hadn't called him, said he hadn't heard from Kurt that last week. He couldn't admit the truth, not to a journalist, not to the world. Emotional, not even to himself. For years, Mark lived with that lie, and the guilt beneath it. What kind of friend am I? He would ask himself. Because this guy used to look up to me. Mark started using harder, drinking more. The shame ate at him from the inside. It wasn't until 2020, 26 years later, that Mark finally told the truth. In his memoir, Sing Backwards and Weep, he confessed everything. The 3 phone calls. The decision not to answer. The assumption that Courtney would be there. The selfishness. The cowardice. I will always carry great guilt about my actions on the day Kurt decided to do what he did, Mark wrote, because I willfully ignored him. He explained that he knew Kurt would have picked up the phone anytime Mark called. That's the kind of friend Kurt was. But when Kurt needed him, Mark wasn't there. Dark, and he's had to live with that ever since. But here's what makes this story even more complicated. Mark also credits Courtney Love with saving his life. Yes, the same Courtney he was avoiding on April 5th. After Kurt's death, Mark spiraled completely. He was using heavily, barely functional, on the edge of his own death. Courtney intervened. She got him help. She wouldn't let him die the way Kurt had. She was directly involved in saving my life, Mark admitted in a 2020 interview. I had to write about that. It's a strange paradox. The person Mark was avoiding to protect himself ended up being the person who kept him alive. And Kurt, the person who called 3 times that day, died alone in a greenhouse, wondering why his friend wouldn't answer the phone. Intense, But there's something else people don't talk about. In 1994, just weeks after Kurt's death, Mark told Rolling Stone, "I never knew Kurt to be suicidal or anything like that. I just knew that he was going through a really tough time." Detective Tom Grant, who was searching for Kurt with Mark and Dylan in those final days, later wrote in his case manual, "Mark Lanegan didn't think Kurt was suicidal either." So if Mark didn't think Kurt was in danger of taking his own life, if he genuinely believed Kurt was just going through a tough time, does that change the calculus of his decision? Mysterious. Maybe. Maybe not. Mark himself doesn't offer himself that excuse. "The shame of my life," he called it. "I just fucking sat there. No qualifiers, no justifications. Just the brutal truth of a decision he can never take back." Mark Lanegan died on February 22, 2022, at the age of 57. He never got to make things right with Kurt, never got to explain, never got to apologize. But in his final years, he made sure people knew the truth. In interviews promoting his memoir, Mark talked openly about that day, about the phone calls, about the guilt. "Kurt reached out to me several times on that day and I fucking ignored him," he told Vice in 2020. "The reason why, and it's no excuse because he would have picked up the phone any time I called, was that I assumed that Courtney was there and I had become conditioned to avoid both of them at the same time." He didn't try to soften it, didn't try to make himself look better. He just told the truth. Emotional, and maybe that's the real legacy of Mark Lanegan. Not the incredible music he made, not the legendary voice, not even the friendship with Kurt Cobain, but the willingness, at the end, to be honest about his greatest failure. To say, "I was wrong. I was selfish. I let my friend down when he needed me most, and I'll carry that forever." Those 3 messages, the ones Kurt left on Mark's answering machine on April 5, 1994, are gone now. Mark never saved them, never revealed exactly what Kurt said in those final calls. Maybe he couldn't bear to listen to them again. Maybe he erased them immediately, trying to forget. Or maybe he kept them for years, listening to them in his darkest moments, punishing himself with Kurt's voice, asking for something Mark refused to give. We'll never know. What we do know is this: Kurt Cobain called his friend 3 times on the last day of his life, and Mark Lanegan didn't answer. Dark whisper. Not once. Would it have made a difference? If Mark had picked up the phone, would Kurt still be alive today? The honest answer is, probably not. Kurt was in a dark place. He'd tried before. He'd made his decision. One phone call, even from someone he looked up to, might not have been enough to change his trajectory. But Mark will never know for sure. And that's the cruelest part. Any advice for young people who want to play music and avoid these trappings? Mark said in that 2020 interview. "Clearly, I'm not the guy to give advice. That should be pretty obvious." Intense. But maybe that is the advice. Answer the phone. When your friend calls, even if it's inconvenient, even if there's drama, even if you're tired or high or just don't feel like dealing with it, answer the fucking phone. Because you never know if it's the last time they'll call. There's a recording that exists. A document of the friendship between Mark Lanegan and Kurt Cobain. It's "Where Did You Sleep Last Night?" from Mark's 1990 album The Winding Sheet. Listen to it. Really listen. You can hear Mark's voice, that incredible, gravelly, world-weary instrument. And underneath, you can hear Kurt, his guitar, his backing vocals. 2 voices, 2 souls, intertwined in a song about cold nights and terrible secrets. In the pines where the sun don't ever shine. It's a murder ballad. A song about betrayal and death and the impossibility of ever feeling warm again. Emotional, and now it's the only collaboration between these 2 giants that we'll ever have. The album they planned, the original songs, the full lead belly tribute, never happened. Just like the phone call on April 5th never happened. Just like the reconciliation never happened. Just like the second chance never happened. All we have is this one song, this one document, this one moment when Mark and Kurt's voices existed together in the same space, creating something beautiful, before everything fell apart. In his memoir, Mark Lanegan didn't shy away from any of it. He told stories about his friends, Lane Staley, Jeffrey Lee Pierce, Kurt Cobain that weren't pretty, that showed them at their worst. Some people criticized him for it, said he was disrespecting the dead. But Mark had a response. You can't tarnish the reputation of a great singer like Lane Staley or a genius like Kurt Cobain just because you told a couple of stories that might not be that pretty about their private lives. It doesn't make them less great. Dramatic. He's right. But he was also human. He struggled, he hurt, he needed help. And sometimes, the people who loved him didn't know how to give it, or didn't want to deal with the mess, or were too caught up in their own problems. That's the truth, the complicated, ugly human truth. And Mark Lanegan spent the last years of his life making sure people understood that truth. Not to excuse himself, but to warn others. Don't make my mistake, he was saying. Don't let your friend down when they need you most. Don't assume they'll be okay.
Don't assume there will be another chance.
Dark. Because sometimes, there isn't. Mark Lanegan never got to tell Kurt Cobain he was sorry. He never got to explain why he didn't answer the phone that day. He never got to say, I loved you, and I failed you, and I'll carry that for the rest of my life. But in writing his memoir, in giving interviews, in being brutally honest about his greatest shame, maybe he found a way to say it anyway. Not to Kurt directly, but to everyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation someday. To everyone who might hear their phone ring and think, I don't want to deal with this right now. To everyone who might let it go to voicemail. Dramatic final. Mark's message is simple. Pick up the phone. Answer the call. Be there. Even when it's hard. Even when it's inconvenient. Even when you don't know what to say. Because the alternative, the guilt, the shame, the what-ifs that never stop, is so much worse. Kurt Cobain called Mark Lanegan 3 times on April 5th, 3 messages on an answering machine. 3 chances to change history. And Mark didn't answer. He's been answering for it ever since. That's the real story of Mark Lanegan and Kurt Cobain. Not the music they made together, not the friendship they shared, but the phone call that never happened, and the 30 years of guilt that followed.